Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. A really very warm welcome to Anglia Ruskin University, and for anybody visiting us for the first time, a particularly warm welcome. I do hope you'll find occasion to come back. This event is part of our contribution to the Cambridge Festival, and every year we take a significant part in the Cambridge Festival. But also we have a whole series of lectures, public engagement activities. You are always really welcome on our campus, and we're grateful to you for joining us this evening. This evening's lecture is not just part of the Cambridge Festival, it's part of, I think, probably the most important and the most positive cycle of lectures that we hold here at ARU. That's a cycle of inaugural lectures. They are lectures where we welcome colleagues who are newly professors with us at Anglia Ruskin. So they're either newly appointed and newly joining us, or they're professors who have been with us for a while, as in the case of Dan, who's been with us, I think, nearly a quarter of a century. I probably wasn't meant to say that. And because of their really great success and their national and international esteem, have achieved a professorship with us. And they're really happy occasions for us, because the sense of belonging to an academic community is important to every one of us, and we all share in that pleasure of seeing the success of our fellow colleagues. So I'm now going to please pass over to the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty, Professor Laurie Butler, who is going properly to introduce you to this evening's speaker. Laurie.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, and a really good evening to you all. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the speaker for tonight's inaugural lecture. So following undergraduate studies at both Bolton and Northumbria universities, and then an MSc in exercise physiology from the University of Essex, Professor Dan Gordon was appointed to ARU in September 2000. Dan, it might be worth asking about that gold watch at some point. With the Vice-Chancellor here, with the remit of establishing a BSc programme in sports science. So Dan attained his PhD, then by publication, from ARU in 2012. He's a BASIS accredited exercise physiologist, a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, as well as a senior fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. Now, in his career to date, Dan has published in excess of 140 papers and abstracts, and his textbook, Coaching Science, has been adopted in higher education institutions both here in the UK and in the USA. His research has forged collaborations from across the world, as well as with multinationals, including Google and Fitbit. In 2020, he established the Exercise Physiology Summer School, an online program attracting students and speakers from across the world. He holds an honorary lectureship and is an associate researcher at the University's Paris-Saclay, as well as being a patron for Living Sport in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Now, under the previous government, Dan was appointed to the parliamentary panel for the Office of Science and Technology, advising on the big trends within culture, media and sport. He's an editor for Frontiers Physiology, as well as the Journal of Sports Science. He's a regular contributor and panel member on the BBC Naked Scientist broadcast, as well as on BBC Radio 4, BBC Radio 5 Live and BBC World News. He's written 22 articles for The Conversation, garnering over 2.9 million reads, as well as articles in the Times, Telegraph and Daily Mail. In addition, Dan worked as the consultant exercise physiologist in the Great Britain Paralympic team, supporting athletes across 3 Paralympic cycles. Now, that would be achievement enough for anybody, but there is more. So as an athlete, Dan competed for Team GB in 3 sports: swimming, athletics, and cycling, winning European medals in athletics for the triple jump and high jump. As a cyclist, he competed in the 2004 Paralympic Games and was European and world champion, and still holds a world record which has stood for a remarkable 22 years. I'm sure you'll agree, simply amazing achievements. So in his talk this evening, Dan will explore how he's applied his research on cardiorespiratory fitness to support Down syndrome, female and diabetic communities. He will also reflect on how his personal journey has mirrored his academic career. So with a talk titled Exercise Physiology for the Forgotten, Challenging Assumptions in Life and Through Science, it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Gordon.
important bit. Turn the mic on. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you very much for so many of you turning up to listen to somebody who suddenly felt very, very old when I suddenly realised I've been here for 25 years. So yes, so my talk is about exercise physiology for the forgotten many, and I'm going to, over the course of the next maybe 40 minutes, those of you who know me, don't panic, I really am going to stick to 40 minutes. I'm going to present 4 vignettes of some of the work that we've been doing, as Laurie mentioned, in Down syndrome, diabetes, female athletes, and then one additional group as well, which I think is of interest. But before I do, what I want to do is start actually not with the forgotten many, but actually with the mentors. For me to be standing here, I've been mentored and I've been guided on this journey, and I've had the privilege to work with these 3 reprobates over an awful long time. So on the left, this is Dr. Phil Hayes. So Phil was my tutor and actually my coach for track and field when I was at the University of Northumbria as an undergraduate student. And it was Phil that really got me excited about cardiorespiratory exercise physiology. In the middle is Dr. Richard Barnes. He's now an emeritus professor of Cambridge University. And Richard is a medic, but he also did a lot of work with the vet school. And it's through Richard, as you're about to see, that an enormous amount of our collaborations, an enormous amount of our work developed. And it was Richard that really allowed my mind to run wild and come up with some ideas. And then on the right, and this is one of the beauties of being visually impaired, is that's a blurred picture. So to me, that just looks normal. This is Dr. Don Keeler. So Don was my mentor when I arrived at ARU. It was Don that appointed me here to ARU and really mentored me in the early stages of my academic career. And we've carried on working. Amazingly, Don's background is plant biochemistry. But Don has actually collaborated an awful lot in the work that we're doing, particularly in regards to where we're now working, which is in relation to genetics and exercise science. I have an enormous debt of gratitude to these 3 gents. Well, one of the things that's quite interesting about, I suppose, my research journey, and Laurie mentioned it a little bit in the preamble, is that my early work actually wasn't really within research, it was in consultancy. And while I was at ARU, I was a consultant physiologist for the Great Britain Paralympic team, and I spent a lot of time testing athletes. So we'd have athletes in the labs and we'd be doing cardiorespiratory testing. I'd be out in the field. So this is out in, most of these photos are taken out in Cyprus, where we were prepping the athletes for the Paralympic Games, and we were getting them acclimatized to running at marathon pace in temperatures. So the day that we've got them on the track here, it was 42 degrees. And they let the blind man collect the lactate, so I was collecting blood samples. And it's fine. When you're working with people who've also got a disability, there's a slightly macabre camaraderie that is going on. But one of the things I started to become concerned about was, as I was testing these athletes, I noticed that we would be pushing them to exhaustion. And what I mean by that is that we really are pushing people to volitional exhaustion. So we're pushing them in an exercise test to the point where they're at maximal heart rate. So imagine your heart rate is now beating close to nearly 200 beats per minute. We're pushing them to the point where the heart is pumping in the region of 40 litres of blood per minute. At the point where their breathing volume, the volume of air that's coming in, is getting close to 250 to 300 litres of air per minute. And we really want them, it sounds a bit daft, but we want them at the point of collapse. Because we want them to go to the point where none of those systems can work any harder. And this is what we call the VO2 max. And I started to notice that despite the fact how fit all these athletes are, and they're all incredible endurance athletes, a large number of them were never really getting to this VO2 max. They were never showing what we really wanted to see. And it started to concern me, and I started to wonder, is it something we're doing in the testing? Is it something to do with the athletes? And it really started to create questions in my own mind. At the same time, I was very fortunate enough to do some work, again, it was kind of consultancy, but it turned into research on the Badwater Ultramarathon. And again, this is the beauty of working in exercise science. We do get to work in some slightly crazy places. This is an ultramarathon through Death Valley. It starts at the lowest point on the planet, so it starts in Badwater, and then they run for about 135 miles through temperatures that are getting into the late 50s, and the record is just under 24 hours for accomplishing this. We were asked to get involved with this because nobody at this point had ever evaluated the physiological responses in these athletes. So I was working with Professor Ralph Benneker, collecting this data, and we were able to work with two athletes at the bottom who were the fastest male in history. So Marshall held the record, and Lisa held the record for female athletes. And we convinced them, I don't quite know how we convinced them when I look back, we convinced them to do a VO2 max test the day before they ran Badwater, and then we convinced them as they finished to drive back with us 3 hours as soon as they stopped to Las Vegas to do another VO2 max test. And I think these athletes, there's part of them where you question about running 135 miles. But we saw this same response. These are incredibly fit athletes, but we're not exhibiting what we routinely would expect to see in terms of getting to volitional exhaustion. So I'm having these questions going on in my mind. But I'm also now getting excited in the notion of extreme endurance and extreme physical activity, which led me then to work with another bizarre group. This is transatlantic rowing. So transatlantic rowing is rowing about 3,000 miles in a two-man boat, and fastest boat wins. And we were working with a group from Cambridge who were going to row from Tenerife, and they were going to row across to Barbados. What was quite extraordinary was one of the guys that was in the boat had never rowed before. So this is the classic, we're going to do this for charity. So what we ended up doing is we started to work with them. We were doing lab testing with these athletes, and we had a lot of the undergraduate students early on helping with us in this data collection. And then the chap in the bottom, if you're based at Essex University, you'll recognize this is Dr. Murray Griffin. So Murray is a sports psychologist, and so we were working really trying to prepare these rowers to find out what was happening across the race. And we then tested them just before they rowed, and then we tested them actually as soon as they stopped. In fact, again, we can manage to convince people to do crazy things. Actually, as they arrived in Barbados, it's a tough job, this one. As they arrived in Barbados, we actually managed to convince them to do some exercise testing for us as soon as they got off the boat. And we looked at things like body composition, and we looked at kind of changes in energy expenditure and so on. And they were expending enormous amounts of calories. I mean, they were expending close to 8,000 calories per day. They actually ran out of food because they hit really high storms and high weather towards the end of the race. And actually, up to that point, they were rowing really, really well. And these became my first publications. And when I look back on them, I was so proud. I was incredibly proud. 2 publications. It was fantastic. This was really early in my academic career. They're not that good. And I look back, it may be hard because of the methods, and maybe because I was quite naive, but I learned an awful lot about working in these extreme environments, but I still had that nagging doubt in the back of my mind about why is it I'm seeing all these bizarre results when I'm pushing these athletes to exhaustion. So I consulted my favorite philosopher. And anybody that knows me knows I'm obsessed with Star Wars. And if anybody's ever been to my office, it is a shrine to the greatest sci-fi saga. If you're a Trekkie, I do apologize. But it is really important. As much as I'm going to stand here today, I'm going to present this journey. Actually, it's littered with things that didn't work. It's littered with studies that never really got off the ground. It's littered with conversations where we start the ball rolling. It just doesn't happen. And I think if there's a message to come, it is, as if you're an early researcher, it's about finding that niche. And it took me 9 years from the start of my academic journey to find the thing where all of this developed. So there was a 9-year period where I felt quite lost, and I tried all sorts of things. But I was learning, I was developing. You had to become quite resilient. And to a certain degree, I'm probably quite lucky. I've had to be resilient in life, having a visual impairment and growing up in a system where if you had a visual impairment or any disability, when I grew up, I'm really showing my age now, in the 70s, I was actually educated initially in remedial education. So the assumption that was made, if you have visual impairment, then it was put with, well, you clearly got some learning impairment, therefore I was put in remedial education. So I had to learn to be resilient, and I actually developed resilient techniques. And fortunately, thanks to my family, I ended up in a specialist education for people with visual impairment and flourished. But my resilience is also really connected to my sport as well. I think you can't compete internationally without being slightly resilient, but also being slightly selfish as well. You've got to really want that thing. You've got to really want it. And there was a degree of this which was, I really want to develop as a researcher, and I really want to fulfill, this journey and finding what it was. And it was amazing. What it was is I had to go back in time. And I had to go back to research published in 1923. And it was published here in Cambridge. So this is from the Hill Laboratory, which is on Downing Street. And Hill won the Nobel Prize for this work. Hill was the first person to run what we call a VO2 max test. So what they're doing here, he's got a Douglas bag, and he's got a two-way breathing valve. And so as he's breathing in, the air is going into the bag, and he's collecting the volume of air, which has got the oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then with his colleague Lupton, who was on a bicycle next to him, he would run at a slightly faster speed and a slightly faster speed until what they started to notice was what you can see in the top panel. If you look in the top panel, you can see that his oxygen consumption, despite the fact his running speed is getting faster and faster, his oxygen consumption stops rising. And this is what we call the plateau at VO2 max. And this is suddenly sparked this interest. I was suddenly going, oh, so hold on. How many of my athletes were really plateauing and how many of them weren't plateauing? And this really sparked the interest because there was some work that came out in the late 90s by a medic stroke physiologist in South Africa, Tim Noakes. And Noakes put forward a philosophy which was this response that you see here is due to actually what's going on more in the brain. And it just didn't sit comfortably with me. This, to me, is a physiological construct. I'd found my interest. I'd found the thing I really was passionate about. I'd found the thing I really can get my teeth into. And so with Professor Barnes at Cambridge, I started supervising natural science students and medical students who were doing their undergraduate projects at Cambridge and then connecting them with our undergraduate students here at ARU. And we collected data over about a 10-year period doing loads and loads of studies to really understand what this response is. Now, Hill was extraordinary because Hill was a great athlete. So the data that you see here is actually only Hill's data. Hill did 47 VO2 max tests to replicate the data. We talk about doing reliability studies now. I mean, that's really reliability study testing. So 47 of them. And actually, in all of those, he showed this response. But what we started to see coming out in the literature was that this plateau response, which is meant to be the indication of somebody's gone to volitional exhaustion because they can't take in any more oxygen, despite the fact running speed is increasing or cycling workload is increasing, there was huge reports of massive variances in some groups saying nobody's producing this plateau response, some groups saying 100% are producing this plateau response, huge variability. And the other thing I just want to point out, which I will come back to later in the lecture, so please pay attention, is Hill recorded this data, which is ventilatory data, and he didn't really comment on it. But you'll notice that the ventilation, so this is a function of the volume of air that you take in and the rate at which you breathe, doesn't show a linear-like response to exercise. It shows this curvy linear response. He didn't really comment on why that was the case. You'll see why that is the case as we get further into this presentation. So we started to challenge it. And if you've not seen a VO2 max test, this is what one looks like.
Push.
Apologies.
Nice. Really nice stuff. Really nice
so
stuff.
This is
Come on. Keep driving.
somebody going to the point of volitional exhaustion. So we're collecting the data in the expired air.
Come on, keep driving your way.
We're trying to maintain longevity. We can do this on bikes, we can do this on treadmill, we can do this on rowers.
Come on, Dom.
But we are pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. Okay, it's great fun. Maybe not so much of you, the participants. But the important bit is the data. in the panel. The data in the panel shows the response of 2 participants. Both have gone to exhaustion. In the lower panel, you see this perfect leveling out in the VO2 response. So the work rate is still going up, but they're not taking in any more oxygen. So how are they managing to exercise if they can't get any more oxygen? Because that must mean that heart rate's at its maximum, the cardiac output's maximal, stroke volume is maximal, and the amount of oxygen you're extracting in the muscle, the arterial-venous oxygen difference, must be maximal. But what about the person at the top? In the person at the top, the VO2 is still rising. So where is the difference? And is the person whose data is at the top, have they really gone to max? Have they really given a max effort if the VO2 is no longer rising? So I developed a hypothesis. My hypothesis was this, that the only way that they can be maintaining exercise with the VO2 leveling out is by working anaerobically. Despite the fact they're working under aerobic conditions, that is in the conditions where they're using oxygen, if oxygen is no longer rising, they must be working using anaerobic substrate metabolism. So this then became the focus of the work. And we published a plethora of papers. All of these papers that you see here have got and were led by undergraduate students both here at ARU and through Cambridge, all of which were designed to challenge that assumption in a multiple different ways. So we'd challenge it initially, and then we would challenge our own idea. So we were not frightened to go, okay, let's see if it really holds up, and we challenged it in multiple domains. We ended up with the final study in this series, which is what you see at the bottom of the panel here, was we demonstrated, as you can see in the top panel, that the MAOD is what we call a measure of anaerobic capacity. The delta VO2 is the change in oxygen consumption towards the end of that test. So my hypothesis was that the bigger the MAOD, which is the measure of anaerobic capacity, the smaller the change in the VO2, the delta VO2, and that's what we found. So people who had a larger anaerobic capacity were able to produce a maximal effort, which is counterintuitive because it's a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness, and yet the limiting factor was anaerobic capability. The final study really that we've done in this area, it's not that we've kind of lost interest, it's kind of spawned new studies, is we then looked at this genetically. Were the people who were actually able to produce this plateau response genetically predisposed to this? So we collected genetic data from our participants, we had them doing repeat tests, and the key thing to see is that the 3 genes that have been highlighted, so actin-3, interleukin-6, and ADRB213, are all anaerobic-based genes. PGC1 alpha, which I've just put on the graph just because it's an important one there, is a gene that regulates endurance capability, and yet has absolutely no association with the ability to produce a plateau at VO2 max. In other words, no association with able to give a maximal effort in this kind of test. So this was really, really exciting. It really kind of sparked my desire and interest. And in fact, the genetic work led on to us actually getting a Vice-Chancellor Scholarship and PhD here at ARU with Henry Chung, where we took our understanding and our learning from that initial study on genetics and started to look at actually the susceptibility of training, and are we genetically predisposed? In other words, is there a genetic function to trainability? And we've looked at that both in cardiorespiratory fitness, but also in relation to markers of body composition, things like BMI and so on. And Henry's now gone on to a successful career at Essex University. So very well done. So, quite a long time, but I had to set the scene for you. Which brings us to vignette 1. So vignette 1 is this. This is the assumption that has been made. The assumption that always existed was males and females respond to exercise in the same way. And it sounds slightly bizarre. You're probably sitting here going, maybe you think they do or whatever. But when I, again, looked at the data we were collecting, I could see there were different responses. It's not, is one group fitter than the other? It's that actually when we train males and we train females, the biological responses were different. And I was sparked, or my interest was sparked, when this paper came out. And I looked at this paper, this is really interesting. So they've collected here elite female athletes and moderately trained females, and they've tracked one of the measures that I've been interested in, which is cardiac output, so the volume of blood that's being ejected from the heart across a minute, and they've tracked it in a VO2 max test. And what they showed was there was a difference, not surprisingly, I don't think, between the elite athletes who had a higher cardiac output. They have a bigger heart, so the morphology of the heart is much bigger. They've got a large left ventricle. They have a bigger left ventricular wall, so they're able to eject more blood per beat of the heart. But this didn't sit comfortably with me, because they brought these females in, and I kept thinking, there's a point that's missing here. And the point that they're missing is they've not taken into account anything to do with the female sex hormones, menstrual function. And it's very much a taboo subject, and I think it's very much a taboo subject talking to you as a male. People have looked at me going, really? Should we talk? Yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter whether we're male or female. It's science is science. We need to challenge this thing. So I spoke to my consultant. So this is my best friend, and I encourage anybody to have a dog, because you can have long conversations with them, and they will always agree with you. And I vividly remember being on a walk and chatting away, talking absolutely, what on earth he thought was going on, I've no idea. And thinking, I think this is where we need to go. I think we now need to move into this domain and start to look at this work in relation to the plateau that I've just been talking about, but also start to really ask the question. Because extraordinarily, this was in 2011. And in 2011, there was almost no work that had been published that was using properly controlled studies that had evaluated the impact of menstrual function on any form of athletic performance in any population group. So we started to develop a range of studies. So this is one of the studies. I'm going to show you just a couple of the studies that we've done, because this fits very much in that mode that we've been talking about. So this is where we were looking at cardiac responses across the phases of the menstrual cycle. And what we did was we had a control group, which was a group of participants who were taking a monophasic oral contraceptive pill. So they had a 21-day period of controlled estrogen, and then a 7-day period where fundamentally the estrogen concentration is reduced. And then we had a regularly menstruating group of participants. We tracked menstrual function for 3 months prior to the study. And then we recorded hormone concentrations throughout the study in relation to the predicted phases of the menstrual cycle. These are notoriously really difficult studies to do, because there's huge amounts of potential variability that you're going to see in the data. But what we ended up with was this kind of data set that you see here. So this shows you in the bottom panel the stroke volume response. Now, stroke volume reflects the volume of blood that's ejected per beat of the heart. And if you multiply stroke volume by heart rate, you get cardiac output, which is in the top panel. And what you can see is, and you have to trust me on this, in the lower part of the stroke volume response, this is our mid-follicular phase. So this is the phase in the menstrual cycle where estrogen is relatively low, but it's on a climb, and progesterone is relatively low. But the line at the top, that's menses. So that is the phase which we technically call the bleed phase. And there's a massive disparity in the stroke volume response between these two groups. They're all 4 phases are producing the standard response, which again goes against what the paper that I showed you a moment ago was suggesting. They were suggesting that stroke volume just keeps rising. This is the conventional response. Stroke volume cannot keep rising during exercise, because there's got to be a point where the volume of blood that we get into the ventricle reaches its maximum. And the only way you can drive cardiac output is through heart rate. So this was really fascinating. This is the first study to show this. We didn't see the same response in our oral contraceptive pill group. We also then saw, which I'm not showing here, we also saw differences in the plateau response between our menstruating group and our oral contraceptive group. And the question was, well, why? Well, what we did was we ran, and if you're kind of an aficionado of kind of exercise phys, we ran what's called a reverse Fick equation. Sounds very technical, it's not. In a reverse Fick equation, you fundamentally record the cardiac data. So we use a technique called thoracic impedance cardiography. We record the cardiac data, we record the VO2 data, and according to the Fick principle, VO2, I should ask my undergraduates this, so VO2 equals cardiac output times AVO2 difference. So if I know the cardiac output and know the VO2, I can now work out the AVO2 difference, which is fundamentally the amount of oxygen that's been extracted at the muscle. And what we found was that in our menses-based group, the AVO2 difference was significantly reduced. They were extracting far less oxygen per beat of the heart at the muscle. So the compensatory effect was to stimulate stroke volume to basically provide more oxygen to the working muscle. So this was a really profound kind of finding. But it then got me thinking a little bit, which was, okay, this is cardiorespiratory, and I like a challenge. I thought, well, what about if we look at something which is completely left field, which is in strength training? So completely outside my comfort zone. So everything I've done to this point is to do with oxygen consumption, and this was really working with Professor Barnes, and we were like, I think this might be right. There might be something we can really look at here that might be of real interest to us. So we followed a very similar approach, tracking across the menstrual phases, and we were tracking strength using isokinetic dynamometry. And we did this fundamentally just using concentric muscle contractions, but we did it across a range of angular velocities. So we did it from slow angular velocities, which are more fundamentally linked to hypertrophy, so that is kind of muscular size, up to high angular velocities, which tend to be more associated with neuromuscular function. And what we found was that, not surprisingly, when we look at the progesterone to estrogen ratio, it's highest in the mid-luteal phase. So that kind of confirmed that we'd got our participants in the right phase. But what you can see, it's not that clear on the graph, but the red trace that you can see there, in the red trace, that is menses, and the yellow trace is the luteal phase. So this suddenly sparked an interest. This was kind of confirming to a certain degree what we'd seen with the cardiorespiratory data, but it also confirmed what had come out from a laboratory pretty much at the same time in the Netherlands by Janse de Jong's group, who were working with rat models. And they found in rat models that when the rats were exposed to resistance-based exercise, it bears thinking about, when the rats were exposed to resistance-based exercise, they found that during their luteal phase, they were producing and exerting more force. And what their group demonstrated was that skeletal muscle tissue is estrogen sensitive. And in fact, the myosin in the muscle itself, right down into the actual myofibrils themselves, is an estrogen sensitive protein. And so what they were postulating, and really what we confirmed, was when the estrogen concentration is raised, you're fundamentally able to recruit more muscle fibers to exhibit more force. And the data really bore that out, that they were generating more force at the slower angular velocities, which are fundamentally about the kind of the muscle size, than they were at the high angular velocities, which were to do with the neuromuscular responses. So, that's vignette 1. So vignette 2 is an area that I've been fascinated with for a long time. I've never run a marathon, but I'm fascinated by marathon running because it links to my work with the endurance athletes. But I was starting to look at data and starting to question, why do athletes do certain things? And this is where I started to get into the idea of what I call citizen scienceship, and the idea of working with organizations outside of academia who were in essence posing and challenging the questions rather than us. Because quite often, particularly in the sporting world, coaches have been doing these things for 20 years. It's the academics that come in and think we're really original and then demonstrate it. They've been doing this. And what I started to observe was this is the only paper up to the point where we did our work, which was published in the early 80s, that had ever recruited and tested recreational marathon runners. So all the research, all the training advice that was being given to any endurance runner in the world was based upon elite athletes. And if you look at the sample sizes here, they're so small. And actually, when you look at the speeds at which the recreational runners are running at, that's still quite quick. And this really staggered me because there's a massive marathon running boom. At the time, people were moving into things like the couch to 5K, and they were progressing up. And I was starting to think, this seems really crazy that we haven't got any training advice. We've got no understanding about the way in which we best prepare recreational marathon runners. And particularly when we start to think about them running for charity. And we also think about the fact that there's a lot of incidences of injury and unfortunately incidents of death, mostly in recreational marathon runners, in these big city situations. I happen to be doing, as I am tonight, a science festival talk. And sitting in the audience was Sarah Whiteman, who's at the top here. And Sarah's a coach in Cambridge. And she came at the end of the talk and she asked me the same question that was in my head, which was, I want to know why athletes do some really strange things in marathon races. Why do I train somebody, why do they not follow what they're meant to do in a marathon race? Why do they stop? Why does their pace change? And so we collaborated on a series of studies which involved simple surveys. So we went down to the London Marathon and we just surveyed marathon runners as they were signing in, and we asked them some really basic questions. We asked them age, we asked them their sex, we asked them their marathon PB, we asked them how many marathons you've run, and we asked them what time they think they're going to run the marathon in. And working with Ian Brown, who is on the screen, is at the bottom of the screen, who was in ARU within computing, and Ite Basovic, who was a sports psychologist here, is now over in Florida, we developed a paradigm to kind of understand the way in which pacing happens. On the back of that, and I'm going to show you both sets of data simultaneously, I thought, right, we can understand the way in which athletes might pace in the race. Let's go and get a data set that we can really provide information, not just about how these athletes pace, this massive group, but actually how we best train them. So I got slightly ambitious and said, we're going to recruit 200 participants. I was advised that was slightly OTT. We ended up recruiting well over 90 participants. So this ended up becoming the biggest marathon training study and physiological testing study that's ever been published. And we brought runners in from all over the country, and we basically did treadmill testing, as you can see here, and then we tied it in with undergraduate projects, so students were working on this at the same time while we were working with these athletes, and it became a fantastic environment where we collected loads and loads of data. So what did we see? Now this is where we hope the video works. So, let's give it a moment. It worked earlier. Right. So this is data from all of our runners that were in the London Marathon. And what we were able to do was web scrape. So we knew who these runners were. We web scraped all their data. So we basically got all their 5-kilometer splits. And then what we did was we mapped that data against whether they were running under speed or over speed, and whether they'd over-predicted or under-predicted. And then each of these triangles is a person, and they relate to whether they're males or females. I'm not going to go into the depth of that, age categories, and so on. But it is a fascinating thing to watch. So this is, it plays. Come on. It is fascinating. Let's try again. There we go. Here we go. So this is each runner and their response in real time. So what you can see is at the moment we're not at half distance. They're all following a fairly uniform pattern, but when they get to about 21, 22K, watch what starts to happen. And now I want you to watch this little triangle. There's a brown triangle. If you watch this brown triangle, it's amazing. Towards the end of the race, they're all huge variability in pace. It's all fluctuating around. Look at that one. And then suddenly comes back. So whether it was a toilet break, I don't know. There was something certainly going on. But that gave us real insight into pacing variability in this group of athletes. Okay, so if I go forward, there we go. So we then published a number of studies. This is just a couple of them. And unfortunately, one of the guys that's involved in this at the moment, he can't be here. He's actually collecting data at the moment for his PhD. And I just want to show you this. This is what it is like to be running at marathon pace on a treadmill. So at the moment, we've got marathon runners in the labs, and we're asking them to run 15 miles on a treadmill at marathon pace. Because we really want to understand now, we've got data in the field, we now want to understand what's going on physiologically in the marathon. So we're collecting expired air and blood samples and so on. So just to show you this. So this is at marathon pace. So if you think of how fast is this, he's running at well over 16 kilometers an hour. And he makes it look very, very easy.
So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, get in the bar.
Okay. So they step off, we collect the samples, and they go again. And that allows us to now understand what is going on in the marathon itself. So what we found...
4, 3,
Pause him.
1.
He's running very fast. So what we found was, in the actual data set of the training, we were the first study to really understand that VO2 max, despite all the conversation I've had with you earlier on, wasn't that important. Didn't really matter. That actually the VO2 max difference between the fastest runners who were running sub 2 hours 30 was almost the same as the runners that were running to 4.5 hours. But actually what was much, much more important was how economical they were. So if you want to think of this in a non-sporting context, it's the difference between having a car with a massive engine, unless you're Jeremy Clarkson, not that important, but miles per gallon is important. And that's what we were able to demonstrate for the first time. The result of that is we've been able to cultivate a marathon PhD group, and we've got Matt Slater, who's in the singlet, he's the one that's collecting data at the moment, and then Johnny Melville, who is looking at basically why people drop out in the marathon, and we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we've taken data, we've got the biggest data set ever collected. We've now got data from over 1.9 million runners. And we're starting to understand why athletes drop out in the races and why people get into trouble in the races. And then David Whitlock, who is really looking at fundamentally what is the constraint, which is time. How do you maximize time when people are trying to run a marathon and trying to best themselves? So I mentioned citizen science-ship, and Laurie very kindly mentioned that I've written for the conversation, and I have 22 times. 14 of those are conversation pieces which I've written with PhD students. And the conversation is a fantastic opportunity to really get science out to the masses. And it allows us to communicate with massive, massive numbers of people and really get people engaged in science and get people engaged in research. And of course, it allows PhD students to get actively involved and learn to write, perhaps to a lay audience rather than perhaps to a scientific audience. Which brings us to this. So this is a massive assumption that's been made. Exercise is not safe for the Down syndrome community. I was approached, and this is a great example, read every email that comes in. So I was approached, it was in December 2000, it was literally the day we were closing for Christmas, and an email came in, and it was kind of, read it. Thank God I read it. It was from a company in Canada who happened to be, oddly, the marketing company for Facebook and Coke. And they'd been approached to launch a marketing campaign by the Canadian Down Syndrome Society on the benefits of exercise. And they said, yeah, we can do that, but nobody pays attention. It's amazing for them to say, nobody pays attention to marketing campaigns. This is a marketing company saying this. What you need is evidence. And they found a piece that we'd written about 6 years before, which was a small review of literature to do with Down syndrome and exercise. I'd had a PhD student at Cambridge University who'd been working on this. And they asked the question, which is the really important question, was, is it safe, but can exercise fundamentally improve not just physical capacity, but cognitive health? And so we developed what is called mindsets. And we developed the mindsets study. Now, I'm hoping this one's going to play as well. Okay.
Chris Nikic raced for 17 hours to cross this finish line, running straight into the history books.
Up until a couple of years ago, we did everything we could to help him develop and be able to do more, but we never actually pushed him as far as we should have. And through his development as a triathlete, I started to see both his physical and cognitive ability improving at a dramatic rate. Forever, we've been told that exercise beyond very basic playing is dangerous for our kids.
I remember one of our occupational therapies saying to me, your son will never be able to jump. And that's one thing that really stuck in my head. How come he's not going to be able to jump? Any kid can jump.
I am a firm believer that exercise helps people with Down syndrome, but we need to continue to prove it. And the way we do that is with good research.
My name is Dr. Dan Gord.
My name is Henry Modka.
My name is Mike Helmanen.
I am an Associate Professor of Cardiorespiratory Physiology.
Creative Lead for Google in Canada.
I'm the CEO here at Posit Science, and we make a brain training program called Brain HQ. So we were really excited when we heard from the Canadian Down Syndrome Society about this study.
No group has ever asked the really simple and important question, which is, can physical activity benefit somebody's cognitive processing? We're going to recruit a population of about 200 individuals with Down syndrome. I'm going to use an app that allows us to record the distances covered, the speeds, the heart rates. Everybody's then going to also complete what we call a brain training test.
It's one thing to go for a run, but then cross-referencing it with the brain patterns and seeing how those two things work in conjunction, that's a home run.
It's almost like a new medication. But imagine now if the medication is simply doing a bit of exercise. And actually that medication enhances your ability to engage with society.
If the Mindset app does show a strong correlation between exercise and cognitive ability, it definitely pushes us to want to push him more. As soon as he achieves something, he does. He looks at us like, I've got this, see?
I can do
like,
it.
What's next?
We are here to prove that when our bodies get stronger, our minds get stronger too. Oh yeah.
What's the missing part to all of this? It's you.
Join us.
Join us.
Let's do this.
Chris went from being an average kid with Down syndrome 3 years ago to an Ironman, a public speaker, an author, and so much more at this point. It's amazing what exercise can do and how it can change your life.
He's a character. So, an extraordinary opportunity, and it required us to develop a study which really was a...
Chris Nikic...
Go past that. A citizens' science study. So we recruited participants. We didn't get the magic 200. I don't know what it is about 200. I've noticed it's come up a couple of times. But we ended up having the largest study of its kind that's ever been conducted. We recruited initially over 140 participants. We ended up working with a group that sustained this. Viv, who's in the audience, will know better the numbers than me, but I think it's in the regions of the 90s that we had. And we recruited them across the world. We had participants who got hold of our study who were in Myanmar, Ukraine, South Africa, the US, Canada. It was truly a global study. And we had to develop techniques that allowed our participants with their parents and caregivers to become the scientists. We couldn't go and collect the data for them. They had to learn how to do this. So we had to create tools for them. We had to create videos. We had to create awareness campaigns. We had to have somebody at this end in the UK, who's Viv, who's sitting in the audience, who really was almost like the equivalent of a fitness instructor on the end of Zoom or Teams, guiding them and helping them. We provided them through Google with Fitbits. We provided them with the Brain HQ data, and then we were able to track this work. And we produced the first 2 papers have come out. We've got so much more data. We've just completed an 18-month follow-up study from this. And this group that's sitting at the bottom, I cannot thank enough. Some from ARU, so Matt Jewis and Mike Ferrandino and Adrian Scruton and Viv, Mergebach and Georges Pinto and Marie Jernigan from Paris-Saclay. Without these guys and without Google and Fitbit and Brain HQ, this could never, ever have happened. The net result is we've now got a full-time PhD student who's carrying on the mindset study. I'm kind of telling you how good it is before I show you the data. The Canadian Down Syndrome Society, on the back of this, have launched the Mindsets Wellness Campaign. So they've now developed a campaign based upon the data to fundamentally increase physical activity and cognitive health in the Down syndrome community. And extraordinarily, based upon the data that we produced, Adidas have now developed the first ever running shoe for people with Down syndrome. because the feet of those with Down syndrome are actually very, very different in terms of the kind of the morphology. So what did we find? It better be good. Well, what we found was that there was a real interest. And British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences took a real gamble, and they asked us to produce the first ever expert statement on the benefits of exercise for Down syndrome on both physical and cognitive health. This is the first time this has ever been done, and this is really about shifting awareness, both in the UK but overseas. That was a real shift. And if you'll just let me, I just want to show you, this is what we asked our participants to do. And I want you to go back to that graph I mentioned earlier on. I said, I hope you're paying attention, which was the hill graph. And I showed you the ventilatory response. The reason that was important was the reason the ventilation suddenly increased, it bent, was because our participants, or the participants in that study, sorry, are moving from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. It's what we call a gas exchange threshold. It's really important. We needed to know this for this study, but I had no way. I couldn't take Douglas bags or breath-by-breath systems. I couldn't do blood testing. So what did we do? We asked our participants to do what's called a talk test. So we asked them to do exercise and progressively get faster, just walking, and get faster and faster. And at the end of this, they had to sing. But we had to come up with something which was universal across the world.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to Catherine.
So we had them singing Happy Birthday. And this is in Canada. It snows a lot in Canada. So they were prepared to exercise in the snow, in the cold, while we were collecting the data. And then this is a real example of citizen science-ship. We also had them collecting data on mood states. If I can find the actual... Where's the plus button? Where's the play button? There you go.
Que ça arrive des fois que tu es découragé.
De racisme, oui, un petit peu.
Tu es découragé un petit peu des
Oui,
fois.
oui.
Ah, vraiment? Tu es sûr? Tu es sûr de ce que je vais écrire?
Oui.
OK. Alors,
so we're having to teach people
découragé.
how to use this perception of mood state questionnaire, fill it
petit
in,
peu. OK.
and we get the data back.
Maintenant, est-ce que tu as...
So we really created this enormous network of people helping us, really in many ways to help themselves.
Que ça...
So what did we find? Well, this is the pre to post in distance. So this is a test called the 6-minute walking test. It's a clinical test that is used globally. And we saw that in two of our groups that I'm showing here, so we had 4 groups. We had a control group, we had a group that just did cognitive training, we had a group that just did exercise, and we had a combined group that got the rough end of the wedge. They had to do the exercise and the cognitive training. But what we found was doing exercise, not surprisingly, they increased their cardiorespiratory fitness. The distance is our metric of cardiorespiratory fitness. And we also found in our combined group, that's not the exciting stuff. This is the exciting stuff. Doing exercise had enormous benefits on cognitive health. So we're using here 2 tests which are based upon on Stroop. So this is kind of a decision-making task. If there's any psychologists in the room, you'll understand this. But to see a 55% decrease in mistakes made is an enormous achievement. And that's in our combined group. In our exercising group, nearly a 38% decrease in the number of mistakes being made. So the question is, why were we seeing these improvements? Well, the theory that we're working with is that during exercise, you're having to pay, or the participants are having to pay an awful lot of attention to what is going on in the surrounding environment. So this is to do with the notion of optic flow. They're having to make decisions about where to place the foot. They're having to make decisions about where they are within the environment in relation to the obstacles. You could see walking in the snow as an example. And all of this then translated across to the performance in these cognitive metrics. So you can understand why I'm really rather excited about this. And this is kind of an area now that I'm spending an awful lot of time working in. And it gives me so much satisfaction working with this population group who are enormously underrepresented. And the final one I'm going to deal with, and I'm going to be relatively quick on this one, because it's a new field that we're working with, and this is with diabetic feet and diabetic foot patients. And this really comes full circle. We started to look, and this is with Marie Jernegon based out at Paris-Saclay, we started to look at a technique which is called ischemic preconditioning. In ischemic preconditioning, what we do, and it sounds so counterintuitive, is we stop blood flow to a limb. So this is the equivalent to going to your GP surgery, having the cuff put on the arm, the cuff inflates, and suddenly the lower part of the arm feels really numb, and it's like, oh, it's really hard. What we started to understand is if I reduce blood flow to a limb, it creates a hypoxic environment. It stimulates an environment where we get a release of what is called hypoxic-inducing factor. The hypoxic-inducing factor triggers the process of angiogenesis. Fundamentally, you grow over time, if I keep repeating this, blood vessels. If I can grow blood vessels in a foot that's got ulceration, if I've got greater blood vessels and greater oxygen availability, I can reduce either susceptibility to ulceration, or I can actually start to reverse some of that ulceration. So on the back of this, I've been very lucky. I've had a second VC scholarship, thank you. And we had Chloe French. In fact, Chloe is just finishing up her PhD at the moment. And we've started to look at this work. And we did some work also with a PhD candidate out at Paris-Saclay, who spent some time over here at ARU. And the final video I'm going to show you is a VO2 max test. That doesn't look like what I showed you earlier on. This is a VO2 max test taking all our understanding for the past 20-odd years, and now what we've done is we're going to do a VO2 max test on the foot. We want to understand what the foot is doing in our patients. So what we've done is we've got them on this. This is a dynamometer that I mentioned earlier on for strength testing. We've isolated the foot. We've got them wearing the mask, which is going to record oxygen consumption. We've then got on the foot itself, we've got probes. We've got what's called near-infrared spectroscopy, which allows us to record the amount of oxygen in the circulation. And we've also got a laser Doppler, which allows us to record blood velocity and blood temperature. And we do a ramp test. We basically make the test get harder and harder, and this becomes our fitness metric for our participants. I'm just going to show you this very briefly. Okay, I apologize for the filming. Blind man was filming at this point. So, but it's the same equivalent of running faster. We're just pushing the work that the foot is being asked to do. So it's the same equivalent. So what have we found? Or I say, what has Chloe found, really? I'm standing here, and it's Chloe's incredible work, is that we found that basically just doing 4 weeks of this ischemic preconditioning, so this is just doing an occlusion where we occlude blood flow for 5 minutes and we release it for 5 minutes, and we do that 3 times, and we just do that a couple of times a week, it increased the oxygen availability in the foot. If I can increase oxygen availability, I can now increase the healing process within the foot. And this has really now driven on. So we've now got major grant applications going in to really start to push this on. We've got a big one that's gone in France, and we're just developing one in the UK to go with to Diabetes UK to really start to understand, A, the mechanisms behind this, but then really to put this into the real world, and actually can we use this in a safe manner that really improves the health. And the number I want to leave you with on this, which is why is this so important? In the UK, each week, there are 186 amputations to the lower leg due to diabetes. This is really important, and it prevents people being able to be mobile. It prevents people actually enjoying life. It has huge ramifications. So anything that we can do that's going to improve that is of real importance to us. I started the talk thanking my 3 mentors, the 3 stooges. I'm going to thank these 3. I cannot do half of the work that I do. So Viv Merschbach, who is on the left, Viv has been with us from undergraduate level and then has stayed on. And as somebody with visual impairment, I find a lot of things quite difficult to do. So Viv has worked with me as a research assistant, and now she works with me as a support worker, really acting as my eyes, but also as my conscience. Viv is the sane person in the relationship. So I'm the person that will go, let's do this, and she's going, no, no, we can't do that. But without Viv, I really cannot thank you enough for putting up with me and working with me. On the right is James Baker. James, again, came from undergraduate and then spent time working with me as a research assistant. Got me into an awful lot of trouble, but again, was phenomenal in terms of actually having somebody on the ground that could work with the data collection and really support in the areas that I really was unable to work. And then in the middle, contrary to popular opinion, she does sometimes get on a bike. This is Marie Jernigan, who I've mentioned, who's based out of Paris-Saclay. I first met Marie when she just sent an email to me back in, I think, 2008, 2009, saying, is it possible that I can come and spend time in your lab on an internship? She came, she spent her time on the internship working with me and the data collection we were doing with our undergraduates, which we then published, and Marie was then publishing with us. That relationship has carried on, and we're now doing huge amounts of work in relation to cardiorespiratory physiology, in relation to the ischemic preconditioning, and it's a fantastic relationship, and it's a fantastic collaboration to have. So to all three of you, I really cannot thank you enough. And then to this bunch of reprobates. To those that are with us now and those that perhaps are with us in previous years, my colleagues, I have an enormous debt of gratitude to all of you. As much as I am standing here giving this presentation, in many ways, the awarding of a professorship is actually, although DG has the professorship, it's a professorship that really reflects all the work that we've done within sport and exercise sciences. I couldn't be standing here without, and genuinely mean this, without the support of all of my colleagues, including the troublemaker on the right, which is Nathan, our lab technician, who has really been with me from the start. Nathan was in the very, very first cohort that I ever taught. And Nathan has been here, and again, Nathan is incredible in terms of, I will come up with zany ideas, and Nathan rolls his eyes, and suddenly, miraculously, this Heath Robinson piece of kit is developed for me. So thank you to all of you. I really, really do mean it. And then my final set of thanks is my family. So unfortunately, we lost my dad a few years ago. He was an incredible cyclist. We found some of his trophies a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember the exact number. Alex, who's my nephew, was in the audience, he'll probably remember better than me, but he held national records for 24-hour time trialing, and he'd done over 400 miles. We worked out he was riding 20 miles an hour non-stop. I think, in fact, I know he'd be incredibly proud of what I've managed to achieve. To my mum, who's sitting in the middle, with my troublemaker, which is my other dog, which is Winnie, who really has, with my dad, really guided me through life, and actually were inspirations. They never let me hide behind my disability, so there was no chance where I could go, well, I can't do it because I can't see. So I was encouraged to do everything. And the net result was I tried everything. I couldn't use it as an excuse. I just had to find ways in which to work with what I have got. And actually, in many ways, if I hadn't got a visual impairment, I wouldn't have been a Paralympian. So it was quite a blessing, right? So, and then to my wife, Lynn, and son, Daniel, in the far corner, who have really had to put up with a lot. They had to put up with me as an athlete when, as I said right at the start, you have to be incredibly selfish. You have to be very driven. You have to be in that position where really, and it really did, cycling mattered more than anything. And really to allow me to just pontificate and just support me in everything that I've done. Again, to all of you, I really, really do thank you very, very much. So at that point, I thank you for your time and I thank you for your attention, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Dan has very kindly agreed to take some questions, so I'm hoping you have some questions, because certainly I found that really inspiring and entertaining. And there's so many threads that I hope you'll follow up. There will be a drink and some, I think even some edibles right after, so you will be able to ask him questions as well. But please may I by a question to Danny. From the floor. Thank you.
On the marathon with all the dots that were moving around,
yes,
was that in any way linked to undulations in going uphill and downhill?
That's a really good question, yeah. And so the data that I showed you there, that's from London. And London, if anybody's ever run London, is considered to be a relatively flat course. It actually goes downhill in the first 2.5K. And it was really interesting, the first 2.5K, nobody was running excessively fast. It could be associated, but it didn't seem, when you mapped those responses, it didn't seem to map to changes in terrain. It didn't seem to map to changes where they would go into an environment where there were no crowds, for example. So it did seem to be independent. Now, I think if I did this on data from, say, the Barcelona Marathon, where you end up running to the very end, if you've ever been to Barcelona, you know where Montjuic is, and you run up Montjuic, why you would do it, I don't know. Absolutely, you would see a difference. But I think what would happen is then you get an anticipatory response. You know that that's coming. So the net result is you will adjust your strategy because you know that that hill's coming. London, it's flat, so you would hope that that is a representation of what they're actually doing.
Yeah, following up from that, Dan, anything to do with hitting the wall?
To use the mic, so people online.
Following up from that marathon study, Dan, was it anything to do with hitting the wall?
I think there was no run. Well, okay, in the extreme, there was no runners in that group that I'm showing there that dropped out. So we didn't have the dropouts. What we don't know is what was happening in terms of things like muscle glycogen and so on. But given the fact that in some cases there were, and it was the one group of real interest were our males who were the 21 to 24s. They had the worst pacing strategy of everybody, and they over-egged what they thought they were meant to be doing, and as an average, that group missed their predicted time by over 34 minutes. Our best group were our females over 70s. And our over 70 runners and experience, they managed to hit their prediction time within less than 2 minutes. So it was really quite interesting. So whether there is a hitting the wall effect, I think this is really the work that Jonathan Melville's doing with his PhD now, which is this dropout thing. And I think that will perhaps unpick whether it is a hitting the wall factor that is contributing to the change in pace. It's just that it's so noticeable that they go way too fast at the start. And then the problem is, if you go too fast at the start, you create a fatigue deficit. You can never pull that back. The only way you can pull it back is slow down so dramatically that really you're going to miss the performance outcome.
I found out something quite interesting probably about 2 years ago. It doesn't matter how fast you run the marathon, you use the same amount of energy.
Irrespective of the speed?
Yeah.
I've got a question about your blood flow restriction study. Do you think it could benefit other disorders in terms of, say, for example, Raynaud's disease?
It's a really good question. I think the answer is I would like to think so. I mean, any condition which has got a circulatory limitation where we create the occlusion, and the bit I didn't really explain was when you release the occlusion, you get what's called a hyperemia. And the hyperemic effect is fundamentally you get an overshoot in blood flow going into the arteries and the capillaries. And that creates what we call a shear stress. And the shear stress is fundamentally what causes the process of angiogenesis, and that's what causes increased capillarization. So yeah, I think something like Raynaud's, any disease which fundamentally has a circulatory limitation, one would argue it should be beneficial to them.
I can volunteer for the study.
Perfect.
So I was really interested to hear about sort of the hormonal effects with women and how that affects VO2 max, etc. How could that be applied to perimenopause, postmenopause, and that sort of thing? Is there any research that's been done, or is there any plans to do any?
It's a really cool question. It's interesting that really, I wouldn't say it's on the back of our work, but it feels like it's on the back of our work. There was a sudden increase in interest in this field. And the area of peri and menopausal has started to play a pivotal role. the difficulty that we're having in those kind of studies is, one, what becomes your control group? So do you use males? Well, you can't really use males because it's just an absolutely unfair comparison to make. You can't compare to a menstruating group because of the irregulations in hormones. And you can't now use, interestingly, we're suddenly realizing we probably can't use individuals that are using contraception, because we're actually starting to now find there's an interference effect between the contraception and things like estrogen reception. So it's a slightly long-winded answer to say it's all open at the moment. We don't know, but it's an area that really does deserve an awful lot of research going into it.
Thank you. And I think let's take one last question, and I think there's a question over here.
Claire, Nick, my question actually. My specific question was whether Dan had any top tips on optimising exercise physiology for the postmenopausal women asking for a friend.
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose the truth of anything is within this is what we do know in the data is that strength training may be more beneficial than endurance training, and we're starting to find this in the menopausal groups, that because of all the other changes in hormone concentration, although strength training doesn't sound like it should be very beneficial, it's actually got huge benefits on things like joint stiffness, it's got benefits on bone mineral density and muscular strength, but it actually also does develop cardiorespiratory fitness. And so if you're somebody who's physically active, and I know Kes is physically active, I would argue that actually if you're doing running, I would actually, if you can, incorporate that with any form of exercise that increases resistance. So whether that is even swimming or whether that is strength training, because the benefits, one is to say in terms of bone mineral density, but also we're starting to understand strength training is probably more beneficial in terms of immune function than cardiorespiratory fitness. And actually the immune system benefits outweigh what we probably are seeing when we do more conventional endurance training.
Dan, thank you so much. A really, really enjoyable and inspiring talk. Laurie is going to thank you on behalf of your faculty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
Laurie.
Microphone. Dan, thank you so much. So, I think one thing I've learned this evening is that the Death Valley Ultramarathon is possibly the most horrific thing I've ever heard of in my entire career as an academic, and I certainly won't be partaking in that in case there was any doubt. But look, thank you so much. I mean, I think, I've had the pleasure of hearing Dan talk on a number of occasions now, and I just find you such, an incredible communicator. I mean, just such a skillful communicator. I think what you've sort of, demonstrated tonight is just so many different ways in which a modern researcher needs to work and to communicate with his audience. So, obviously, traditional articles, lots of traditional articles in academic journals, but also, your use of the conversation to communicate to a much, much wider general audience. I mean, I think, really a top tip for any younger researcher to understand that is just an essential part of the skill set. Your use of consultancy, your use of technology, your use of citizen science, your use of working with different patient groups, it's all part of a skill set that a researcher needs to be truly successful. And I think just a wonderful example of what you need to be able to do. More broadly than that, I think, just inspiring. I mean, both as, as an athlete and as an academic and as a colleague to many here at ARU and across the globe. Every time I hear you talk, I just want to join your research group. And I think you have that impact on people. It really is just, an amazing, I think, enthusiasm that you bring to research, which is just really, really compelling. And I think I just sort of finished off by just sort of saying, I mean, I think, in terms of demonstrating the values of ARU that we have as an institution, I think that the work that you do, the sorts of different groups that you reach, I can't think of a better example of the impact of research on public benefit, on public health, and I just think it's just fantastic work. So thank you on behalf of all of us. I've got a small token of our appreciation for you.
Thank you.
And on behalf of us all, thank you very much indeed. A really brilliant talk, and we look forward to the next sort of 25 years here at ARU as well. So, thank you, Dan.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And just finally, as the Vice-Chancellor said, if you can stay and have a drink and a bite to eat with Dan and friends and family, then please do so. If you are heading home now, then thank you so much for joining us, and see you.